They say time heals all wounds, but they never tell you what to do when the wound comes from your own family and it never stops bleeding. My name is Margaret Hall. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in St. Augustine, Florida, for most of my life. To most folks around here, I'm the quiet woman with the garden full of hibiscus, the one who used to be a nurse at the local clinic. I smile when I buy groceries. I wave to the mailman. I keep my porch light on, even when I don't expect visitors. But behind all that, I carry a secret, one that has burned in silence for over 6 decades. This story isn't easy for me to tell. For years, I swallowed it, buried it, tried to forget it ever happened. I told myself I was being dramatic, that no one would believe me, that my mother surely had her reasons. But now, at this point in my life, I'm done protecting the people who never protected me. I was 8 years old when my father died. His name was Thomas Hall. He worked with his hands, built wooden boats, and could fix anything with a hammer and a scrap of hope. He wasn't a perfect man, but he loved me. I remember sitting on his lap while he read from tattered paperbacks, or letting me help him sand the edges of a canoe he was building. When he died in a workplace accident, something in our house, something in my mother broke in a way that never healed. My mother, Linda, was a proud woman, beautiful, meticulous, and terribly concerned with what the neighbors thought. We lived in a little yellow house near King Street. It had flower boxes and a white fence, the kind of house people would describe as cozy without knowing what went on inside. After Daddy's death, things changed quickly. My mother didn't mourn publicly. She wore black for a week and then started dressing up again. Red lipstick, heels, and perfume that lingered long after she left the room. She began bringing home a man named Raymond Ellis. Raymond was smooth, handsome in a polished, greasy kind of way. He owned a used appliance shop on the edge of town and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. At first, I thought he was just one of the gentleman callers Mama talked about when she thought I wasn't listening. But within 6 months, they were married, and that's when the real nightmare began. He moved into our house like he'd always belonged. He brought new furniture, changed the curtains, started laying down rules I'd never heard before. I was told to be polite, to obey, to stay quiet when grown-ups were talking. My mother said Raymond was doing us a favor, that a man stepping up for a widow and her child deserved respect. I didn't know how to explain the way my stomach twisted when he looked at me too long, or how his fingers brushed just a little too low on my back when I passed him in the kitchen. I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe that. I really did, but I wasn't. One night, a few weeks after they got married, I woke up to the sound of floorboards creaking. Our house was old wood floors that whispered every movement. I heard the knob on my door turn slowly. The hinges moaned, and then I saw him, Raymond, standing in my doorway, in the shadows. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, then turned and walked away. I pulled the covers over my head and shook until morning. I told my mother the next day. I said he came into my room and it scared me. I didn't even say anything else, just that. She slapped me, hard. "Don't you ever lie like that again," she said through clenched teeth. "You should be grateful that man puts food on our table." I remember standing in the bathroom after, staring at my red cheek in the mirror and whispering, "But I'm just a child." That was the day I learned my voice didn't matter in that house. It didn't end with one visit. Raymond came into my room again, and again, and again. Each time, I froze. I would lie still, heart racing, afraid to breathe too loud. Some nights, he'd just stand there. Other nights, he didn't stop at the door. And through it all, my mother never asked questions, never checked on me. She went to bed early, played piano on Sundays, and smiled for the neighbors. It was like she chose not to see, or maybe she did see, and decided not to care. For decades, I've carried this story inside me like a splinter too deep to remove, but I'm tired of silence, tired of pretending it didn't shape every part of my life the way I love, the way I trust, the way I fear being seen. This is my truth, and I will not hide it any longer. I was once a little girl who believed in happy endings. Before my father died, my world was simple. I remember climbing the oak tree in our backyard barefoot, catching fireflies with an old mason jar, and listening to my father hum as he carved cedar blocks in the shed. He always smelled like sawdust and coffee, and when he held my hand, it felt like the world couldn't touch me. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that was enough. When he died, everything changed overnight. Mama Linda Hall wasn't the same woman after the accident. She used to hum while cooking or braid my hair before church, but after the funeral, she stopped singing. She stopped touching me altogether. Some days, it was like she couldn't even look at me. I think she blamed me somehow. I reminded her too much of him, my eyes, my quiet nature, the way I'd line up my books the same way Daddy did his tools. She started disappearing in the evenings, said she had errands or appointments. But I wasn't a fool. I saw her dresses change, her makeup get heavier. I'd smell the perfume she only wore on special occasions and wonder why she was going out while I was left alone with a box of cereal and an old radio. Then came Raymond Ellis. The first time she introduced him to me, I was sitting on the porch reading. He wore a starched white shirt, slicked back hair, and dark sunglasses. He took them off as he smiled, crouching down in front of me like I was a puppy to be won over. "You must be Margaret," he said. "Your mama tells me you're smart as a whip." I didn't answer. "Well," he chuckled, "quiet's good. Ain't nothing wrong with a girl knowing when to keep her mouth shut." I remember every word, every syllable. The way Mama laughed nervously and nudged him. I remember how my stomach twisted, though I couldn't have explained why at the time. Raymond began coming around more. He brought groceries once, fixed the squeaky front door, took Mama to the movies. I hoped he was just passing through. But within a few months, they announced they were getting married. No family, no friends, just a quiet courthouse ceremony, followed by a dinner at the local steakhouse. I wore a pale blue dress that Mama said made me look less sickly. Raymond gave me a doll I didn't ask for and said, "Now we're a real family," but I didn't feel like family. He moved into our house like a shadow filling corners, darkening light. The furniture changed. The rules changed. Suddenly, I had to knock before entering the kitchen. I had to eat everything on my plate, even when it made me sick. I had to say yes, sir, and thank you, even when I didn't mean it. And Mama. She drifted further away. She started dressing like she was someone else, tighter dresses, brighter lipstick. She stopped helping me with homework, stopped asking about school altogether. I'd bring home straight A's and she'd barely glance at them. I began to shrink. At night, the house creaked differently. I started noticing things. The way Raymond's footsteps slowed outside my door. How he lingered near the bathroom when I was inside. The way he'd accidentally brush against me while reaching for something in the pantry. It was small things at first. Things I told myself were nothing, because if they weren't nothing, then it meant something terrible was happening. And I didn't want to believe that. One night, after I had stayed home sick from school, I overheard them in the kitchen. "She's too sensitive," Raymond was saying, always looking at me like I did something wrong. "She's still a child," Mama replied. Her voice clipped. He laughed. "You mean a burden? You're lucky I didn't walk away." There was a pause, then the sound of a chair scraping the floor. "I need a man in this house. Raymond, I need stability. If she's in the way of that, you'll handle it." Those words made my skin crawl. "You'll handle it." After that, I didn't just shrink. I disappeared. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I ate quickly and washed my own dishes. I spent as much time outside the house as I could, pretending to study at the library or walking aimlessly through town until dark. When I did come home, I made myself invisible. I thought that if I could just stay small enough, quiet enough, maybe he'd forget I existed. But monsters don't forget. They wait. And when they're allowed to roam free inside your home, they grow bolder. When Raymond started entering my room at night, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I froze. And afterward, I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, wishing I could lift out of my body and float away. I told Mama once, just once, I was 11. I said, "Mama, he comes into my room at night." She didn't slap me this time. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood up from the table, walked to the sink, and began washing dishes. Without turning around, she said, "You will not ruin this family." And that was that. In that moment, I realized I didn't have a mother anymore. I had a witness who chose not to see, a protector who closed her eyes. So I stopped talking, stopped hoping, and started planning, because if no one was going to save me, I'd have to save myself. There's a difference between fear and terror. Fear is the feeling that creeps up your spine when you hear a noise in the dark. Terror is knowing that noise has a name and it lives in the room down the hall. By the time I was 12, Raymond no longer waited until the house was quiet to corner me. He no longer crept. He no longer tested the waters. He had tested them enough and realized my mother would never stop him, that no one would. It started in small, calculated ways, the way predators always begin. He'd ask me to come sit beside him when Mama was out on the porch, smoking and sipping sweet tea. "Come here, darlin'. Let me braid your hair," he'd say. His fingers would linger too long at the nape of my neck, grazing skin in ways no father figure should ever dare. I hated the smell of his cologne, cheap, musky, suffocating. I still smell it in my nightmares. When I'd pull away, he'd smirk. "Don't be ungrateful. You want to make me look bad, and always, just a few feet away." My mother would sit quietly, her gaze fixed on the street, pretending she didn't hear. The worst part wasn't the abuse. It was the permission that lived in my mother's silence. You'd be surprised how quickly a child learns to split themselves in two. By day, I was the polite, obedient daughter. I folded laundry, helped with dinner, did my homework. By night, I was a ghost still, silent, waiting for the door to creak open. There were no locks on my door. Raymond had removed it one Saturday afternoon, saying privacy made kids secretive. That was the word he used. Secretive. I didn't need privacy, he said. I needed accountability. That night, I slept on the floor behind my bed, trying to hide in the shadows. He found me anyway. There are moments, very specific moments, that stay frozen in your bones, not just in memory, but in your muscles, in the way your breath shortens, the way your body reacts to a certain tone or sound. For me, it was the click of his belt, the low hum of him whispering my name, the pressure of his hand on my shoulder, the words, "You're lucky I care for you." Afterward, I would crawl into the bathroom and scrub my skin raw with my mother's lavender soap until the water turned pink and my fingertips went numb. Then I'd stare at myself in the mirror and repeat the same 3 words. Not your fault. I didn't know if I believed them, but I said them anyway. At school, I tried to pretend everything was normal. I smiled when my teachers called me smart. I answered questions correctly. I never missed an assignment, but I avoided eye contact. I flinched when someone touched my shoulder. And when a counselor once asked if things were okay at home, I smiled too quickly and said, "Yes, ma'am. My stepfather's real strict, but he keeps us in line." She nodded. She never asked again. One afternoon, after an especially cruel night, I mustered the courage to tell someone. A woman named Miss Grady. She was my choir teacher, tall and stern with kind eyes. I stayed after class and blurted out, "My stepfather touches me." She looked at me hard, really looked. "What do you mean?" "Margaret," she asked, her voice careful. I panicked. The words scrambled in my throat. "Just weird stuff." I said, "I don't like it." She asked if he hit me. "No," I whispered. She asked if I wanted to talk to a counselor. I said no. I watched her face fall with the weight of helplessness. I didn't realize it then, but I know now she didn't know what she could legally do without more. She probably thought she was protecting me by not making it worse. So she gave me a pat on the hand and said, "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." But I didn't go back because I knew what would happen if the truth ever reached my house. Raymond would kill me, and my mother. My mother would help him bury the lie. There was one moment, a breaking point that cracked everything. It was late September. The air was still heavy with Florida heat, and a storm was rumbling in the distance. I had just turned 13. Raymond came into my room drunk, not stumbling, not loud, but with a focused, mean kind of quiet. That night was worse than any before. I won't recount every detail. Some things I've buried too deep, even now. But I'll tell you this when he was done. He looked me in the eye and said, "You ever say a word about this, and your mama will take my side. She already has." He was right. That was the part that broke me. The next morning, I didn't speak. I didn't eat. I didn't cry. I just packed a small canvas bag with 2 sets of clothes, $5 from my piggy bank, and a notebook I had filled with poems I never let anyone read. Then, while Mama was folding laundry and Raymond was outside fixing the car, I walked out the front door, just walked. No plan, no destination. I kept walking until I reached the edge of town, until the heat soaked my shirt through, until I found a gas station and sat behind the dumpster, shaking and wondering what I had just done. I wasn't running away. I was escaping a prison no one else could see. I never went back. That was the beginning of the hardest years of my life, but it was also the moment I saved myself. I had never slept outside before. That first night after I ran away, I curled up behind the dumpster of a rundown gas station just off the old highway. The ground was damp. My clothes stuck to my skin. Every sound made me flinch: a raccoon in the trash, a car door slamming somewhere far away, the low hum of distant traffic. But it was still better than sleeping in that house, better than the terror of waiting for the doorknob to turn in the middle of the night. I was 13 years old, alone, and free for the first time in years. When the sun came up, I stood and brushed myself off. My body ached from the cold concrete, and my stomach growled so loud I was afraid someone would hear it. I had $5, a bag of clothes, and no plan, but I had something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I started walking again, this time heading west out of St. Augustine. I knew from school that Jacksonville was a big city. Bigger meant more people. More people meant I could disappear, maybe even start over. It took me 2 days to get there, hitchhiking with a young trucker named Denny, who noticed me sitting on the guardrail. He didn't ask too many questions, just offered me a bottle of water and half a sandwich, and dropped me off near a church on the edge of town. "You take care now, sweetheart," he said, and that was it. I wandered the streets for a while, keeping my head down. It didn't take long before someone noticed. Her name was Mildred Carter. She was sweeping the front step of a small laundromat when she spotted me loitering by the vending machine, trying to act like I belonged there. She had deep brown skin, silver hair tied up in a scarf, and eyes that saw right through me. She walked over, offered me a biscuit wrapped in foil, and said, "You runnin' from trouble." Baby, I froze. She didn't push, just handed me the biscuit, nodded, and walked back inside. I stood there for a long time, biscuit in hand, until I finally followed her in. That's how it started, with a biscuit and a look of understanding. Mildred let me sit in the back room of her laundromat. She didn't press for details, not right away. Just gave me a blanket, a place to rest, and a bowl of chicken soup that made me cry the second I tasted it. She reminded me of someone I'd never had a mother who noticed, who cared. When I finally told her my story, she didn't interrupt. She didn't gasp or ask why I hadn't told someone sooner. She just held my hand and said, "Ain't no child supposed to carry that alone." Mildred took me in, not legally, not officially, but in every way that mattered. She made up a cot in the back room of her house and told the neighbors I was a cousin's daughter from downstate. I helped her fold laundry at the shop during the day and read library books at night. I enrolled myself in the local middle school using a fake address and Mildred's last name. No one ever asked. For the first time, I slept through the night without fear. I started to smile again, slowly, cautiously. I stopped jumping at every sudden sound. I began to breathe like a person instead of a prisoner. But healing isn't a straight line, and the past has a way of finding you. One day, about 3 months after I arrived, a police officer showed up at the laundromat. I was in the back, folding towels. I heard Mildred's voice, firm but calm, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The officer was tall, young, and polite. He asked my name. I lied. He pulled out a photograph. It was me, a school picture from 5th grade, printed in black and white. My real name, Margaret Hall, written in ballpoint pen across the back. "I'm not here to take you back," he said gently, "but we do need to talk." I went cold. My legs trembled. "Your stepfather reported you missing, said you were confused, and ran away after a disagreement." I didn't speak, just stared at the photo. "Do you feel safe where you are?" he asked. I looked at Mildred, who stood just behind him with her arms crossed. "Yes," I said. "This is the safest I've ever been." He nodded. That officer, his name was Officer Blake, turned out to be one of the few adults in authority who actually listened. Mildred backed me up. She called in a favor from a pastor she knew, and together, they connected me with a social worker who specialized in cases like mine. I was terrified the system would send me back. But once the details of what had happened began to unfold, And once it was clear that I was being protected, they made a different decision. They let me stay. Eventually, my mother stopped looking for me, or maybe she just stopped pretending to. I never saw her again, never heard a word from her, not a letter, not a phone call, not even a rumor. It was like I had died to her. And in a way, maybe I had. The daughter who obeyed, the girl who begged to be seen, that girl was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone stronger. I stayed with Mildred through high school, then took night classes to become a certified nursing assistant. I worked in hospitals, clinics, eventually earned my RN license by the time I was 26. I had built a life, a good life, one I never thought I'd be allowed to have. But the memories never disappeared. They lived in the quiet moments, in the way I always double-checked locks, in the way I flinched when someone stood behind me too long. I didn't talk about what happened, not for decades, not until much later. It took me years to understand that silence wasn't strength. It was survival. But healing, real healing, requires truth, spoken, acknowledged. And one day, it came time for me to speak. But not yet. First, I had more to live. There's a quiet kind of power in routine, getting up early, putting on your uniform, brewing the same pot of coffee, clocking in, clocking out. For a long time, my life revolved around that rhythm. It gave me a sense of control, of normalcy, something I could count on when everything else in my past felt like quicksand. After I got my nursing license, I took a job at a community clinic in Jacksonville. It wasn't glamorous, leaky ceilings, outdated equipment, patients lined up down the hallway, but it was meaningful. I cared for young mothers, veterans, elderly folks on fixed incomes. I listened. I soothed. I held hands in silence and wiped tears without needing to ask why. No one there knew what I had survived. I didn't tell them. I had become very good at pretending. Even when I moved back to St. Augustine in my 40s to care for Mildred after her stroke, I kept my past tucked neatly away, like an old photograph hidden at the bottom of a drawer. I told people I had a complicated childhood, that I left home young and made my own way. No one ever pried, and I never invited them to. Mildred recovered slowly, and we settled into a new life together. She was slower now, walked with a cane, but her fire was still there. She'd watch court shows in the afternoon and mutter foolishness under her breath every time someone lied. "You ought to tell your story one day," she said to me once, out of the blue. "Ain't no shame in survival." I just smiled and shook my head. I wasn't ready. But then one night, something changed. I was working the late shift at the clinic. A girl came in, barely 15. She had bruises on her arms and a blank stare I recognized too well. She wouldn't say what happened, wouldn't name who hurt her, but she clung to my hand when I sat beside her. Her lips trembled when I said, "You don't have to speak until you're ready. But I see you. I believe you." After she left, I went into the supply closet, closed the door, and wept, not just for her, but for the girl I had once been, for the silence I'd carried, for all the children who had walked through hell and thought it was just life. That night, I pulled out my old journal, the one I had carried in that canvas bag the day I ran away. Pages of poetry, rambling thoughts, and drawings filled with shadows. It smelled like mildew now. The corners were torn, but my handwriting was still there, raw and uneven, and in the margins of one page, written with trembling fingers at age 13, were the words, "I am not what he did to me." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I wrote underneath it, "But I am what I choose to become." The next morning, I called Debbie Simmons, a former co-worker who had gone on to work in mental health advocacy. I told her I had something to share, not for publicity, not for sympathy, just for truth. We met at a quiet cafe by the marina. I was nervous. My hands shook as I stirred sugar into my tea, but when I started talking, the words came faster than I expected. Decades of silence unraveled in minutes. She didn't interrupt. She didn't look away. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "Margaret," she said softly, "this story could save someone's life." I didn't know if I believed that yet, but I knew it was time. Together, Debbie and I worked on a public education campaign focused on abuse awareness for older women, an often overlooked group. We organized community talks, invited counselors, hosted small gatherings at local libraries and churches. At first, I stayed behind the scenes. I helped set up chairs, made coffee, handed out pamphlets, but eventually, Debbie asked me to speak, just once, a short testimony. No pressure, so I did. I stood at the front of a church basement one rainy Thursday evening, looking out at a group of 20 women, most of them older than me, some with walkers, some with trembling hands, some with eyes full of quiet grief. I told them my story, not all the darkest pieces, not yet, but enough. When I finished, the room was silent. And then a woman in the back raised her hand. "I thought I was the only one," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. Another woman nodded, then another. We stayed for hours that night, talking, crying, listening, healing. And I realized Mildred had been right all along. There is no shame in survival, but there is power in sharing it. That moment opened a door in me I thought had been permanently sealed. I was no longer a victim hiding behind politeness and routine. I was a witness, a guide, a woman finally standing in the truth of her life. I didn't just survive. I chose to live. It had been nearly 60 years since I'd last seen my mother. In all those decades, I never imagined I'd go back. I never wanted to walk through the memories of that house or feel the stale weight of her silence again. But life has a way of folding in on itself when you least expect it. And sometimes the only way forward is through the door you swore you'd never open. The call came from a distant cousin. I barely remembered, someone on my father's side who tracked me down through a church contact. My mother had died. She was 90 years old, alone, no obituary, no ceremony, just a cold, plain message: Linda Hall passed away in her home. You were listed as next of kin. I stared at the voicemail for a long time. My first feeling wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger. It was emptiness. Mildred had died years earlier. Debbie was the one I called instead. Her voice was soft when she answered, and I told her everything. "I don't know what to do." I said, "You don't owe her anything, Margaret, but if there's something you need to say to her memory, maybe this is your time." So I went, not for her, but for me. The house in St. Augustine looked smaller than I remembered. Time had peeled the paint from the siding, and the garden out front had long since wilted. The wind chimes were still hanging from the porch, rusted and crooked, clinking softly in the breeze. The same front door, the one I once walked through as a little girl with scraped knees and silent prayers, creaked open as I turned the knob. The inside smelled like mothballs and dust. Furniture hadn't moved in decades. There were picture frames with yellowed photos on the mantel, but none of me, just my father and her and a life they once pretended to have. In the bedroom, I found a metal box beneath her dresser. Inside were bills, old letters, and one small journal, my mother's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Pages were sparse. She had never been a woman of many words, but one entry stood out, dated years ago. Raymond was watching her again. I saw it. I knew it. But I said nothing. I didn't know how to choose between protecting my child and surviving myself. So I chose silence, and I've paid for it every day since. I read it twice, 3 times. It wasn't an apology. Not exactly, but it was something I never thought I'd get. Proof that she knew, that she chose not to act, and that somewhere, in her own quiet, bitter way, she regretted it. I sat on the edge of her bed and cried, not because she was gone, but because I'd waited my whole life for a mother I never really had. And now, I was done waiting. I didn't keep the journal. I left it there, along with everything else. I walked out the front door, closed it behind me, and felt the weight of the past finally begin to lift. I drove straight to the beach, parked the car, took off my shoes. The sand was warm beneath my feet, and the ocean breeze caught in my hair, just like it used to when I was a girl. I stood at the edge of the waves, breathing in salt and freedom, and I said out loud to no one but the wind, "You didn't break me." The tide rolled in and kissed my ankles, and I smiled. In the weeks that followed, I felt different, lighter. Not healed completely, but whole in a way I had never been. I shared more of my story publicly, not just at the Women's Center, but through written essays and interviews with advocacy groups. Women from across the state began writing to me, some older, some much younger, thanking me for saying what they couldn't yet say themselves. One letter I'll never forget came from a woman in her 70s named Grace, who wrote, "I thought it was too late for my story to matter, but you reminded me that every voice counts, no matter how long it takes to speak. That's when I knew I'd done what I came here to do. I hadn't just escaped a home filled with darkness. I had built a new one with my words, my choices, and my courage. A home made of truth, and in that home, no one could ever hurt me again. After the beach that day, something shifted inside me permanently. I no longer felt like the girl who had run away in silence. I was a woman who had returned, spoken, and walked back out on her own terms. But my story didn't end with survival. It began to open doors for others. I started volunteering at the St. Augustine Women's Advocacy Center, speaking to small groups of women, many of them in their 50s, 60s, and even 70s, who had carried their own secrets through decades of shame, denial, and fear. Some had never told a soul. Others had tried and been dismissed. Some looked like they had it all together, perfect hair, pressed blouses, smiling eyes. But I could see behind the polish because I had worn the same mask. One of the first women I truly connected with was Joanne, a 74-year-old retired librarian. She wore pearl earrings and always brought her knitting, but her hands trembled when she spoke. She'd been abused by her older brother throughout her teenage years, and when she told her parents, they had called her a liar and sent her to live with a distant cousin. She'd never spoken of it again until the day she heard my talk. When the group ended that afternoon, she approached me slowly and said, "Your story let me forgive the little girl I was, the one who thought she deserved it." I hugged her, and I felt it how healing moves in both directions. I wasn't just helping them. They were helping me, too. Every woman I met brought a piece of me back I didn't know was still missing. The ones who whispered their stories into coffee mugs, the ones who broke down in tears after decades of holding everything in, the ones who showed up and just sat there, silent, still brave in their own way. Together, we created something sacred, a place where age didn't matter, where time missed didn't disqualify pain, where truth was welcome, no matter how late it arrived. I also began writing letters to the younger women. We mentored those in shelters or counseling programs. I shared parts of my story with them, little by little, and always ended each letter with the same line: "You are not what happened to you. You are who you decide to become next." And I meant every word. One afternoon, while organizing materials for an upcoming workshop, I received an envelope in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting stopped me cold. Sarah Ellis, Raymond's granddaughter. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I sat down at the table and opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, written in trembling, honest script. "Dear Margaret, you don't know me, but I believe you knew my grandfather, Raymond. I'm his granddaughter, his only grandchild. I found out recently what he did to you and to others. I'm writing to say I am so deeply sorry. I know I can't undo what he did, but I wanted to let you know. I believe you. I stand with you. I've spent my adult life trying to be the kind of person who breaks the cycle. My grandfather never faced the justice he deserved, but your courage has inspired mine. Thank you for surviving." I stared at those last words until they blurred. Thank you for surviving. I didn't respond right away. I sat with the letter for a few days, folded neatly in my journal, tucked between pages where I had once scribbled poems about monsters and shadows. But eventually, I wrote her back, not with anger, not even with pain, just with truth. "Dear Sarah, I appreciate your letter more than you know. I want you to know something important. Your grandfather didn't destroy me, and I am glad to hear he didn't destroy you either. If you've chosen a different path, then that is a victory, and one your family probably needed for generations. Take care of your story. It's yours, and it matters." Margaret Hall, I never heard from her again, but I didn't need to, because that letter reminded me that what we survive, what we speak, echoes. It doesn't just liberate us. It can change the path for someone we've never even met. The years that followed were the most peaceful of my life, not because everything became easy. Healing never works like that, but because I finally stopped running. I stopped hiding. The monster from my past no longer had a grip on my nights or my name. And the woman who once turned away from me, my own mother, was no longer a ghost I needed to chase for answers. I had made peace, not with them, but with myself. I spent more time in my garden, tending to the soil with hands that used to tremble, but now felt steady, strong. The hibiscus bloomed brighter than ever. The butterflies returned each spring. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch with a notebook in my lap, writing reflections for the next meeting at the center. One day, I was invited to speak at a statewide conference for survivors over 60. I nearly said no. The idea of standing in front of a ballroom full of strangers, sharing the most intimate parts of my life, made my heart race. But something inside whispered, "You've already lived through the worst. This is just the telling." And so I went. I walked onto the stage in a pale blue blouse and a pair of soft-soled shoes. The lights above were warm. The crowd hushed. I began simply, "My name is Margaret Hall. I'm 72 years old, and I am not a victim. I am a survivor of childhood abuse and of silence." I told them the truth, not all the graphic details, but the heart of it. I told them about my mother, about Raymond, about the fear that had followed me into adulthood. But more importantly, I told them how I found my way back through connection, through purpose, through people who listened when no one else would. After I finished, the audience stood in applause, not because I was special, but because I was familiar. I was every woman who had ever swallowed a scream, every girl who was told to be quiet, every elder who thought it was too late to tell the truth. It wasn't too late. It never is. That talk changed everything. I was invited to join an advisory panel for elder abuse awareness. I helped start a support group specifically for women who had survived long-term abuse and never spoken of it until their 60s or 70s. We called it the second voice, and we filled that room, not with shame, but with stories, with hard truths, with healing. One woman, Clara, was 85 when she stood up for the first time in a room full of peers and said, "My brother hurt me when I was 9, and I've never told a soul until today." We cried with her. We held her hands. In those moments, I saw what survival truly meant. It wasn't just about getting away. It was about reaching back and lifting someone else out. 2. As for me, I no longer needed revenge. I didn't want it. I didn't need to see Raymond punished by law or reputation. Time had already taken care of that. He died years ago in a nursing home, alone and bitter, from what I'd later learn was liver failure. There was no obituary, just a cold record in a public database. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel grief. I felt done. And when you've spent your whole life carrying a weight, being done is the sweetest kind of freedom. Now, each morning I wake up and say the same quiet prayer, not to God necessarily, but to the girl I used to be. I'm still here. I made it. And you did too. In the stillness of my 72nd year, I finally understood what legacy meant. It wasn't about leaving behind wealth or a perfect name. It wasn't about children bearing your resemblance or a street named after you. For me, legacy came in quiet ripples, women finding their voices, girls feeling less alone, and pain no longer being buried in silence. It came in every nod from a woman across the room when I said something she didn't have the words for yet. It came in every letter from someone who whispered, "You gave me permission to speak." That was the life I built, not the life handed to me in that broken house in St. Augustine, but the one I fought for, breath by breath. One spring morning, the director of the Advocacy Center pulled me aside. "We want to create a program for elder survivors," she said. "Workshops, peer mentors, a safe place for women over 60 to tell their stories." Then she smiled and added, "We'd like to name it after you." I was stunned. I didn't cry, not right away. I think I was too overwhelmed. But when I got home that evening and saw the old journal on my bookshelf, the one I carried with me when I ran at 13, I sat down and wept. Not for the girl who ran, but for the woman who stayed, who spoke, and who lived. They called it the Margaret Hall Circle. Every month, I meet with women whose eyes reflect a pain I know too well. Some are ready to talk. Others just listen. We don't rush anyone. We don't expect healing to look the same, but we make space for honesty, for fear, for light to seep in. One afternoon, a woman named Elaine, who'd never spoken before, reached over and held my hand. "I thought I'd go to my grave with this," she whispered. But your story cracked something open in me, and now I want to live the rest of my life free. That was the moment I knew. Everything I endured, it didn't end with me. It became something more. A bridge, a path, a legacy. Now, as I sit by my window, watching the Florida sun melt into the horizon, I often reflect on the road that brought me here. From the frightened girl who slept behind her bed to the woman who stood in front of strangers and told the truth. I have lived many lives within one, and through it all, I've learned this silence may keep you safe for a time, but it will never set you free. I spent decades believing that my story was too old, too messy, too painful to matter. That because I had survived without justice, it wasn't worth telling. That no one would care. That people would look at me and see just another quiet older woman, too late to speak, too broken to heal. But I was wrong. And if you've lived through something terrible and you're carrying it alone, I want you to know you are not too old, you are not too late, and your story matters more than you know. The greatest lesson I've learned is that healing has no expiration date. Whether you're 25 or 75, you deserve peace. You deserve love that does not hurt. You deserve to feel safe in your own body, in your own home, in your own name, and most of all, you deserve to be believed. Telling my story didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the nights I spent in terror or bring back the mother I wish I had. But it did give me something I never thought I'd have again. A voice, a purpose, a place in this world that I chose for myself. Today, the Margaret Hall Circle continues to grow. New women walk through our doors every month trembling, uncertain, but brave enough to show up. And every time one of them shares her truth, I feel the ground shift just a little, like we're all helping tilt the world towards something better, something safer, and I pray it never stops. If you've come this far in listening to my story, thank you. Thank you for bearing witness. Because sometimes what survivors need most isn't advice or rescue. It's just someone willing to see them. If my story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of your own strength or the pain someone you love may have carried, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the one that helps someone else feel less alone. And if you believe in the power of truth, healing, and resilience, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, because every time we tell the truth, we light the way for someone still trapped in the dark. And together, we remind the world we are not what was done to us. We are what we choose to become.